Welcome back to Here for the Truth, everybody. Just want to say this podcast and all our episodes are brought to you by our premium members in our community, Friends of the Truth. Your membership and your support is what allows us to keep doing what we do. So if you enjoy this podcast, if you get value from it and you'd like to support us, you can head to friendsofthetruth.co and become a supporting member on a few tier options. And in exchange, we're offering private, regular monthly calls of incredible value and even some members-only interactive podcasts in there as well, on top of 100 plus hours of privately recorded value content only for our members. Today marks the 7th return of Gavin Nascimento to Here for the Truth. One thing that we've been observing lately is an incredible rise of, re-excavating the history of World War II, which I think is an amazing thing. People asking questions, people offering different perspectives, people engaging in a dialogue, because ultimately that's the process of uncovering the truth. Gavin has been on his own personal journey, watching some viral documentaries such as Europa and others, which explore alternative narratives of Nazism, World War II, and Hitler. And basically he joins us today to share some of his insights and his thoughts.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing with a subject like this is that you have to understand there's so many different researchers, so many different scholars. You know, you can have 1,000 hours of a podcast, and I don't know if you would get down to like the nitty gritty of everything. And I think it's important for any sincere truth seeker to understand that and not just to jump to conclusions because we say something on this podcast or your favorite influencer on Twitter or somewhere else proposes a theory. You know, it's really important, I think, to gather as much as you can and also remain in the mystery of, you know what, maybe I don't know, but it is interesting. And, you know, we have been lied to in so many different ways. Perhaps there are more lies around this, but I think the encouraging thing is that you stay open and curious and continue your own personal process around these subjects.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think the blurriness of history is going to begin to become less of a thing as time rolls on. The thought just occurred to me. Imagine World War II happened in the information age. Imagine there was thousands of podcasts around the world commenting on what was happening on a geopolitical landscape during it. Like that's all part of the archive. That's all part of the history book. You know, so I don't think that, for example, the COVID 2020 era will be blurred in the same way that, you know, different things in the past have been blurred because of the lack of commentary and a lack of, you know.
Yeah. You got so many people on the front lines, like sharing memes, taking videos of things, sharing them.
Yeah.
It's like, again, the 24/7 news reporting. Now, again, with that, you have to be able to discern and filter through bullshit and what's not. But still, there's so much more at our disposal coming at us. Yeah. And for anyone that has the capacity to kind of, you know, dance with it and see, you know, what resonates more. You know, it's so important to cultivate a deep intuition as well around these subjects and what like you sense feels closer towards the truth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Has anyone made a history book of memes yet? I think there's something in that for sure. Anyway, guys, thanks for being here. Lots of love. Thanks for listening. Please follow, like, subscribe, comment in whatever way you can, and enjoy this episode.
You are now listening to the Here for the Truth podcast, hosted by Joel Rafidi and Yerasimos.
All right, everybody. Gavin Nascimento is back. Listeners of this podcast, no doubt, are familiar with his name. I don't know what number episode this is, 5 or 6, something like that for sure. We've had some classics in the past. I definitely recommend going into the back catalog and searching Gavin's name on our website and listening to some of those absolute bangers. This man is a prolific researcher, a prolific seeker of truth, incredibly articulate, a very unique mind. And it's great to have you back, man. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to digging into this complex topic.
Yes, very, very complex topic. Indeed. So I guess let's just have a preface conversation between the three of us about what's giving rise to this conversation. I guess what we're seeing within the alternative mainstream, if you want to call it, is kind of this, I don't know if it's a resurgence or if it's the first surgence of Hitler being promoted as a good guy. Obviously, the facts of history are difficult to trust, but lots of questions around the mainstream narrative of World War II. I definitely have lots of questions in that regard as well. Very viral documentaries such as Europa, The Last Battle, and what's the other one?
Greatest story never told. Is that it, or is something else?
That's it.
Greatest story ever told.
Correct.
Yeah,
Those are the two major ones, man. And in fact, I think it's Europa, The Last Story Never Told. If you go look up on because Google, you can find out kind of what's trending. You can put certain search terms, and that one is as high as it can be, and it has been quite high consistently for quite a long period of time. So this is something people are watching privately, quietly. I've had a lot of people obviously contact me because I've made so much content regarding the dangers of Zionism, and then also the overlap in the relationship between Zionism and Nazism, which seems antithetical, but of course there has been a relationship there. So people have privately been contacting me saying, what do you think about this documentary? So it's definitely imperative that we have a discussion, a critical analysis from both sides, because both sides of this discussion are not presenting an objective viewpoint as I see it.
Yeah. What do you think, I guess, to start off with, has made this topic more popular these days? Like, why are people looking into it? Do you have any idea?
Oh, yeah, for sure, then. So if you actually, well, first of all, I would say it's multifaceted. And even my reasoning and my justification to myself for wanting to dig into this is it's multifaceted. This is a very complex topic, but it needs to be addressed. So historically, both sides have presented a very oversimplified and convoluted perspective of what happened. So there's no context there. You know what I mean? So the one side about the Holocaust took place, it's been very repressive. It's been very imposing. It hasn't actually done or addressed the ideals of Nazism. Why did this take place? And my thing is, you don't ever confront what you perceive to be deception with authoritarianism. You confront it with knowledge, right? You have to have a better idea. Truth is what overcomes deception. Whereas if you try to censor it, you're just going to push things underground. But I would say it's multifaceted first and foremost, that people are becoming disillusioned on a grand scale. Like, it's unprecedented what's going on worldwide. And so naturally now people want to ask, well, what else have we been lied to about? So I'd say that's one of the elements. You want to look into so-called forbidden knowledge. What's the proverbial apple in the tree? What am I not allowed to look at? Then there's some basic tenets, right? Just in relation to being a truth seeker, that expression, I'm just going to paraphrase it, that if you want to see who rules over you, see who you can't criticize. So for people who have a very oversimplified way of thinking, so they disregard critical thinking, which has to be done on a case-by-case basis. You know, subconsciously, I think we all have a proverbial file cabinet in our minds. And in here, we have a folder. This is a left-wing person, this is a right-wing person, this is a Christian, this is a Muslim. And it's very oversimplified rather than approaching things on an individual case-by-case basis and then engaging critical thinking. So yes, that can serve as an indication, that expression that, you know, to see who rules over you, see who you can't criticize. But then, of course, you need to still dig a little bit deeper. You need to say, yeah, okay, that echoes, it was, for example, Mark Twain. He said that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. So there's certain things that rhyme, there's certain red flags, it's foundational principles. And in that regard, we know that the Jewish elitist class or the Zionist establishment are incredibly powerful. So I think now with what's going on with Israel and Palestine, that's further encouraging people because they're seeing this remarkable level of deception and duplicity from the Zionist establishment, which nobody can deny. And then another thing is, once you actually start to look into it, and this is where most of the historian scholars have completely erred and messed up, is again, they have taken the approach of inculcating almost what aligns with atrocity propaganda. So not to say that atrocities were committed, well, hopefully we'll get into all of that stuff, but the way that it's been forced on people, that it's been shoved down their throats, most people are aware of what took place in World War II and the Holocaust and Hitler is, you know, when people think of evil, what I say is that they first think of Hitler and then second they think of the devil as a figure, right? It's like everybody knows who Hitler is. And so once you start to dig into it a little bit, and again, this is where the historians made a huge mess up, is, yes, they want to inculcate the emotional trauma of you. This was horrible. This was terrible. But they aren't picking apart the ideology. And it's because it's very difficult to do. If you read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, it can appeal to people. It can be very appealing. So you have to confront it with the knowledge. You can't, just, emotionally kind of program people to be impulsive. And anybody that questions it, well, you're going to be censored, you're going to be repressed, you're going to be ostracized, you're going to be called an anti-Semite, or you're going to even be arrested and thrown in jail. So the other thing is, once you actually start to look into it, you start to see major correspondences between that time period and what took place in Germany, culturally from the perspective of the Nazis, to what's going on now, where a lot of people on the so-called rights feel the same kind of thing. And they start to see these correspondences and they start to say, ooh, I think Hitler was right. So it's multifaceted, and I'm hoping you guys can give me some kind of pressing questions to help to extract the knowledge, because we can't obviously cover everything in a single podcast.
Well, yeah, I think a subject like this, you'd have to do like 100 podcasts with, to explore so many different angles of it. And then no one person's going to have access to like all the knowledge. And there's so many different books and different things and different opinions. I guess the first thing I want to ask is, because you brought it up, is it true that if you question the Holocaust in Germany, that you could get thrown in prison?
Yeah, it's in Europe, to the best of my knowledge, period. In the world's democracies, where this democracy is supposed to be synonymous with freedom of speech, and value all of that. No, people have literally been thrown in jail for questioning the Holocaust, which that's not how you operate. That is the most hypocritical bullshit imaginable. So naturally, when you do that, what are people going to do? They're going to want to look into it more. It's not rocket science. That's just the nature of a human being. And one of my theories, in fact, is that the way that this has been handled in this almost proverbial landmine way, where you get close to it and then it explodes, right? And it's gotten better. It's become a bit more acceptable now to at least look in that direction and say a few things. Of course, people are becoming a little bit out of control with it because they haven't done proper research. And that's also the fault of this system, this establishment. But one of my theories is, in fact, that because I view it as being so loud, so conspicuous, I think that part of the reason why there are these proverbial landmines is because there are still, and this I can corroborate with actual verifiable evidence, there are still hidden forces behind Zionism that are not necessarily Jewish. Now, at the highest level, elitists, birds of a feather, they flock together and they come in all skin colors, sizes, and shapes. And what's desperately been missed in the historiography, especially from like the pro-Nazi side, is that now everybody becomes Jewish, right? Oh, the meeting at Jekyll Island that cemented the Federal Reserve Bank. Oh, they were all Jewish participants. Or, or they're all Marxists, like Vladimir Jablonski. Oh, he was a Marxist. He was a communist. No, he wasn't. He was like a fascist. So, you would say Erasmus, we could do so many conversations on this. I think one of the best indications, and this also is why it requires such a thorough looking at, is the Europa, the final battle, or the last battle, I can't remember specifically, but that's over 12 hours.
Yeah.
So I've made notes. I've got like half a book of notes to address each thing. Well, I'm hoping in time I can make a full rebuttal.
Let's give this some cohesion and some structure. So should we address, I guess, some of the primary claims of these documentaries, and then we'll have conversations based on that. So I guess starting from the beginning would probably be what instigated World War II.
Well, let's
right?
I agree with that. So I think also let's try to very much hold in mind the people that are totally unfamiliar with the topic, and their knowledge is more so one just of like, oh, horrible, terrible things happened, Nazis are evil. Or then we have the opposite side where it completely tips in a totally inverted way, where Nazis pure evil, pure great, beautiful, holy, heavenly angels, Jews evil, horrible, bad. It's very oversimplified, black and white bullshit.
Caveman shit.
100%.
Yeah. Okay, so are you cool to start with, I guess, the mainstream narrative of how World War II started, super aggressive expansionist policies, and that's all that it was.
Well, look, I think whatever you guys also find to be most, you are both knowledgeable on this topic too. So I think just collectively, you can both bounce off whatever questions you think would be good in an introductory perspective, or even just personal ones that you have. And then perhaps anybody in the comment section who's listening to this, if they have their own personal questions or criticisms, they can also go ahead and put that in there. Maybe in the future we do another one.
Yeah, I think let's start with the beginning of World War II. You know, the mainstream narrative is that Hitler, greedy, power-mongering, expansionist, aggressive policies, and this is what led to the rise of World War II. I guess, yeah, well, where do you stand on that?
Yeah. So everything historically is preceded by something else, right? Like there's a seed that gives rise to another seed, and then another seed. And so we've got to have some kind of knowledge about World War One and what transpired in World War One, or what was done to the German people as a collective aggregate. So precipitating World War One, and I'm going to try not to stretch it out too much, but the German Empire began to rise up. This was around the discovery of oil, the Industrial Revolution. A lot of things were taking place business-wise.
Mm-hmm.
And so the German Empire managed to bypass the Suez Canal, which the British Empire controlled. And they were going to do this with the Basra to Baghdad, or Berlin to Baghdad railroad. And this also gave them basically a fast track to the Middle East. They had done this deal with the Ottoman Empire, which was the Turkish Empire. So this preceded the Middle East area, a very powerful empire for centuries, but then they were conquered actually primarily through debts. It's very sophisticated how it was done. And anyway, so long story short, World War One eventually gets declared. Now, there are different reasons. Least among them is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. As usual, ridiculous shit like that doesn't really make sense. Like the whole world went to war because some dude got assassinated. Okay, Cool story, bro. It was more because, Industrial Revolution, oil had been discovered as a superior form of fuel and energy. And so the British Empire saw that their hegemony was now being challenged by the German Empire. And so gradually this culminates in World War One. And where do the troops first get sent to? They get sent to the oil fields in the Middle East. And a lot of people don't know about that. So this was, like most conflicts, about resources and about strategic positioning and playing the proverbial game of risk in real life, on the grand stage and in the world. Now, Germany actually they fared very well in World War One. They had the upper hand. They offered peace terms. And the British Empire actually refused this. Now, I've been to the Rothschild's archive. It's the official archive of the family, and we may have covered this in the first podcast. I really can't recall. But on there, the Rothschilds themselves speak about the reasoning behind World War One and what culminated in the Balfour Declaration, right? And what they state is that the British Empire, believed and came to rely on the Jews, and that's their terminology, quote unquote, the Jews, to go ahead and get the United States into the war. Now, of course, there's a famous speech from a former Zionist by the name of Benjamin Friedman, where he attested to this a long time ago. But you've obviously got harder evidence with the Rothschilds, because they literally have loaned the British government, and previously the empire, loans throughout its history. And so they got the United States into the war, and they ended up whipping Germany. But now, during that mess, there were horrible things that were done to the German people. The atrocity propaganda was absolutely ridiculous. There's something called Baby on Bayonets. There's also a story about a woman named Nurse Hume, Hume, where, the Nazis, this was pre-Nazi, sorry to everybody out there. So Nazi Germany arose in World War II. I'm just quickly explaining what gave rise to it. And they cut off her breasts and they burnt down this fire full of, soldiers that were injured. Well, Nurse Hume, she shows up and she's got both breasts intact, and she says, no, this simply did not take place. So there were terrible atrocity propaganda in all of the British dependencies. Just remember, the British Empire it spanned vast areas, and it was very closely aligned with the US. So there were atrocity propaganda stories, and this is when film emerged. And so it's very effective at demonizing the German people as an entire whole. Many of them also got thrown into internment camps. And so it was so virulent, this campaign, that they even began to engaged in book burning sessions. They stopped teaching German at the schools. This is very significant because in America, the largest immigrant demographic was actually German. They started to rename German foods and streets with English ones. So a hamburger became a Liberty sandwich, and a German Shepherd became an Alsatian. I shit you not, brother. That's how crazy it is. And just many names of streets and hallmarks were completely renamed. In fact, there were instances, like in the US, where German civilians were tarred and feathered and hung up. So they were stuck in a noose, hanging in a tree. They killed the dude, because this is not necessarily about any particular race being evil, but it's, if the propaganda is there, they can incense people collectively, right? The unconscious hive mind states, and they can weaponize them. And so this was done to the German people. There was also a terrible blockade that killed over 500,000 Germans. And so in the aftermath of a part of part of the treaty that was imposed on Germany was this massive, ridiculous, unreasonable reparation payments that it took several decades to pay it. I think it almost took a century to pay back these reparations. And who do the reparations fall on? It falls on Germany. And so now there was a lot of anger and resentment about what happened during World War I. And now if you read Mein Kampf, what happens with Hitler specifically is just prior to World War I, he begins to recognize that there are all of these Jewish figures, some imagined, some real, that are in positions of great power and control in Germany. And there is truth to this. There were some powerful Jewish elitists in positions of power and control in various parts of Germany. And so they viewed and felt as though Germany had, the Jewish Germans had betrayed them. This is why they lost the war. There was a lot of propaganda about also why Germany lost the war. They couldn't really accept that they had gotten whipped. And so they had come to believe that not only were they thrown under the bus during World War I, which is partly true, but this wasn't just by Jews within Germany, but he also specifically believed that the acculturation or the moral downfall of Germany, because it began to decay. This is another aspect that people that are pro-Holocaust don't really want to address, is that it became a very depraved place, man. Prostitution was rife. Culturally, they started to lose their way big time. It was a cesspool. And so for Hitler, he felt like, no, the Germanic people are being manipulated and exploited and brainwashed to essentially not just be debt slaves to this Jewish world Jewry, but also that they were being morally decapitated. And that's where a lot of kind of the sentiment grew from. Yeah. And then anyways, in terms of World War II, that's what encourages the Nazi ideology. And then there's eugenics, which eugenics is a whole tree from which Nazism is just a branch. That's another thing they don't want us to address that properly, because then what does it do? It implicates the Americans, it implicates the British, it implicates all the elitists all around the world, and it gets into so many other things. But in relation to World War II, that specifically is what inculcated this kind of resentment about the danger of Jewish people. So in Mein Kampf, if you read how Hitler talks about the Jews, man, he just straight up viewed them as evil, as devils. He uses various forms of language, but for him it was a holy war that he was waging or defending himself from world Jewry. And then what happened with Nazi Germany is they start to rearm, they start to build up. And now this is very key. This is something I studied long before I started to get into this. The people that are rearming and helping Germany get built up are the elitists from the Anglo-American section. So Standard Oil, for example, they were the ones that not only gave them the knowledge of how to extract oil as a fuel source from coal, which they had larger reserves of, but there was also a plan under Frederick Delano Roosevelt called the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, and these people were from Wall Street, and then they started to loan money to Germany. And so there was this underhanded activity going on there, but it was also allowing Germany to be rebuilt and rearmed. And the same thing happened with a group known as the Round Table Group. Professor Carroll Quigley, which is an excellent source. You know, he's from the Ivy League schools. He was Bill Clinton's former professor. So you're talking about an establishment historian until he wrote the book, Tragedy and Hope, and then they try to throw him under the bus because he started to illuminate a little bit too much. He talks about how the Round Table Group and the British, they allowed Hitler to also build up and rearm. So essentially what I'm insinuating, without getting into all the details, and you can press me on that if you like to, is that he was allowed to be built up. And I maintain that Hitler was actually more of a patsy. So he was a true believer. He was definitely convicted. He was a true believer, this dude. He's a former soldier. That's another thing that's very significant. And he saw what was going on in World War I. It just incensed him more. But behind him, ideologically, he was inspired by the Americans and the British, the eugenics. And then militarily, he was then armed by the powers that be. People always say, oh, you need to see where the money's coming from. Sure, and you can trace that to the US largely, but you also need to look at where's the fuel coming from, where's the technologies coming from. And once you do that, you start to see a much more interesting picture and image of what really transpired in World War II. And more so, what was the ending of World War II, the post-World War II, is something that also has its roots in World War I. So World War I, after that, was the League of Nations. This was the predecessor to the United Nations and the World Health Organization that sits underneath it and many other institutions. Well, part of what they tried to do with the League of Nations is they try to upgrade the proverbial matrix. So what do I mean by that? Just like the Matrix, the fourth film, every now and then this system has to undergo a facelift. It needs an upgrade to adapt itself from an evolutionary perspective to the people awakening and becoming disillusioned. So it has to take on new shapes and forms and so on. And so the League of Nations, what it did, it started to say, okay, we have all of these countries around the world, they're agitating for independence. So the League of Nations will help oversee their independence in the transition. This is in fact what happened with Palestine and Israel. This was supposed to be a British mandate. So the League of Nations was allegedly in control of that. Now the League of Nations, it ended up failing horribly, but it was meant to be a centralized body of control. In the wake of World War II, the same exact forces, which is the Council on Foreign Relations, which financed, funded, and armed Nazi Germany and Hitler through various corporations like General Motors, like Standard Oil, like the Ethel Gasoline Corporation, like DuPont. The ones that were arming and funding Nazi Germany were also arming and funding the US government. At the same time, the Council on Foreign Relations, through the War and Peace Studies program, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, what were they doing? They were advising the US government on how they should conduct their current wartime policies. So the CFR were dominating both sides, is what I'm saying. And then at the end, they also dictated post-war policy. What was post-war policy? The creation of the United Nations, the creation of the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, and eventually NATO, and also the National Security Act of 1947, which gave rise to the CIA. It centralized what we know today as the Department of Defense and culminated in what is now over 800 military bases internationally. That's a world government. People warning about world government, that's world government. So my point being, if you zoom out, there are much bigger pieces being moved on the chessboard. And I feel like both sides of this debate are very fixated on only one keyhole view.
Was it IG Farben? That was the company that ended up becoming Bayer, or Bayer was part of it?
Yeah, so Bayer was like a subsidiary of IG Farben. And IG Farben, so if people are going to look at this from establishment sources, they're going to try to portray as though IG Farben was kind of hijacked against its will. No, that's not true. IG Farben and Nazi members were so intertwined that, you couldn't really distinguish between the two. So they were very much willing to be a part of the Nazi war effort. And if you look at the statistics, which were collated very well, were tabulated very well by Professor Anthony Sutton in his book, War Streets and the Rise of Hitler, which I recommend everybody check it out. In that particular publication, it shows, man, that the overwhelming majority of the war materials, from just everything, the fuel, the rubber is a very important thing, and just so many other things, were coming directly from IG Farben. Now, in the wake of World War II, and it was broken up, then that's where Bayer comes from, and BASF and a bunch of other modern corporations that continue to do despicably evil things. But essentially, yes, IG Farben was the heart of Nazi Germany. And this is something we haven't really been instructed about very well either, that IG Farben was a massive chemical pharmaceutical company, right? They used vaccines against the population and so on. And what's also very interesting about IG Farben, and this is even less known, is that it had a subsidiary in the United States, IG Farben America. And who sat on the board of this company? Well, it was Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's son. It was one of the Warburg family members. And of course, there was another Warburg family in Nazi Germany that was in charge of the Reichsbank, which was like the counterpart of the Federal Reserve Bank, a private central bank. And of course, they never ever got in any trouble, you know. There was also Jewish influence, is what I'm saying, complicity in helping facilitate what Hitler and the Nazis invariably did. But IG Farben, is one last thing, they were also the second largest shareholder of Standard Oil. They worked very closely with Standard Oil. Standard Oil got accused of treason, literally treason. Got the newspaper articles during World War II. And it wasn't just because of the fuel that they were giving, it was actually because of the rubber, because the US had a rubber shortage for the military. You must remember, you need rubber for the wheels, you need rubber for so many things, for the vehicles and so on. And there was a shortage in the US, and the government was saying, oh, we need rubber. Well, the Rockefeller-controlled Standard Oil, they had the means to get loads of artificial rubber. But they kept that information from the government while simultaneously giving it to the Nazis. So they were accused of treason by then Senator Harry Truman, who, of course, later on became the president.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of the claims that Hitler was potentially a British agent? Gary Hallett has a book called Hitler as a British Agent, and there's lots of improbabilities, you know, considering potential Austrian tramp, street cleaner, you know, the gay prostitute claims, all of a sudden becoming Chancellor of Germany. There's claims that he was illegitimate grandchild of a Rothschild. His grandmother was a maid within the Rothschild household.
So as far as I know, there was, in fact, a genetic test that had by researchers attested to him having Jewish ancestry. Of course, now this is disputed. I haven't dug into it deep enough. And then also, man, I actually meant to ask you specifically for that article that you shared with me, because I haven't thoroughly looked into the whole notion that he was a British asset. Now, for those who, and I want to walk a fine line here, because you get people who are very new to this kind of information. They say that is the most batshit, ridiculous, crazy thing I've ever heard, and they reach for the off button. But then you get people that are so far over the top. That's it, man. You know. Now I haven't dug into it properly, and so sorry, Erasmus. I can see you've got a question there, but just very quickly.
You go.
Yeah, just very quickly. It is possible, and the reason why I say this is if you know the inner workings of a group called the Round Table Movement, and their very strong fixation on globalization, right? It's possible, man. This is a game of so much deception and duplicity that you never know. However, I want to make it very clear to everybody out there, I have not come across evidence myself that has convinced me, but I have not read those books. So naturally, that's something that I needed to dig into first.
Yeah.
The
only thing I was going to say is, while you were speaking, is this is a challenge that we face and we see very often in the alternative research community, is that like some new theory comes across, you know, the interwebs, and then people just latch onto it. No, now this is the thing. This is the real truth.
100%, man. I think one of the fundamental problems is that, and I call it the woke right? The woke left and the woke right, because they're the exact same in the fundamental way, which is to say, and at the same time, we must never be patronizing or condescending. We need to recognize that as a human being, you, me, Joe, the listeners, we can all fall for the same shit, the emotional impulse of something being intoxicating. And so it's very important to develop the capability that when you feel this strong push or pull, you sit with it and you critically consider it. It's not something that magically happens, right? By nature, you know, Joel, you've got a big tribe. You know this, man. By nature, and anybody who's observed children knows they are purely emotional. So this is our first conditioning of how society works and functions. They are purely emotional, man. And so we always have that within us, and we need to be mindful that that actually comes more naturally to us, to be swept up in that which feels good, right? Whether you're the woke left or the woke right. Donald Trump makes me feel good. When the woke, it makes me feel good, this information. so I don't want to deal with whatever is challenging it. But we are all vulnerable mentally to the same shit. And having that healthy humility, I think, is imperative in order to protect yourself from the fact that there are people that weaponize esoteric knowledge, and they are exceptional psychologists and have been since antiquity.
Do you think people have been researching Hitler and World War II more because Trump has been labeled as Hitler? Or like, what came first? You know, like, I'm so curious, like, how this has become.
Yeah, well, you have to remember that documentary, the Europa Last Day. Can one of you guys, do you mind actually just looking that up? Did it come out in 2015 or 2017?
I'll get it.
Yeah, so, I mean, just in that particular regard, and that's a very lengthy documentary, man. That's no joke.
Yeah.
But that came out at a time, whether it was 2015 or 2017, so it took quite some time to put that together, even though it's riddled with bullshit. But it's got some powerful truths in it as well, which need to be addressed. But I think it's inevitable, man, again, because there is a very strong, corrupt, Jewish elitist element in society, the Zionist establishment, most notably personified by the Zionist establishment, because you get Christian Zionists, you get all kinds of, you get African Zionists, 2017. So that's very shortly after Trump rose to power, and I don't think there were any correspondences, any major ones taking place back then. But again, to me, it's multifaceted, man. I see a convergence of things going on. I think people becoming aware of what's going on with Israel and Palestine, I think that's one of the things. And then at the same time, for those who have a bit of insight and awareness of the emergence of Nazi Germany and kind of the dominant ideological environment, sentiment and feeling in the United States and abroad about like, how white people are being repressed or white genocide or being targeted in certain ways culturally. And there's truth to that, right? Like you can't necessarily say, I'm proud to be white. Right? There's certain underhanded shit there, and again, nobody wants to address it. Instead, you shut the person down. So there's truth to that, right? And people, whenever you have a demographic that feels like they aren't letting their voices be heard, guess what happens? They start to get irritated. And that's not because of your skin color, that's science. And that's genuine science, not scientism, but that's just scientific, right? And so, one of the deep ironies also with everything that's taking place, man, and I hope we can also get into it, and it's another fundamental reason why I want to address it, is Germany, the average German was targeted for propaganda and demonized during World War I, and they had these horrible stereotypes attached to it. Same thing happened simultaneously with the Jewish population, and now it's happening largely with the Arab population. In fact, if you go back to the Russian Empire, and then also the British mandate in Palestine, what you'll find is that the stereotype in the past that has been long forgotten is that Jews were terrorists, okay? So in the Russian Empire, they were stereotypically considered to be terrorists. That was the brand that was on them. That's, of course, today now with the Arabs. And it's very similar psychology that's been taking place with it too. And that's another reason why I've actually wanted to address this, because what people just don't get is they have this very collectivist interpretation of reality, which is to say, the Jew is, it's one person, right? The Muslim is one person. Instead of the fact that, of course, it's a complex dynamic, you get individuals, people are going to be different, and demographics tend to act a certain way based on their life experience, not their skin color, not their religion, and so on. Those things tend to be secondary. And so what I see taking place with like, evil Arab terrorists, man, like that's the number one enemy now. This was the exact same shit they used to say about the Jews in the past. And naturally, because they make easy scapegoats by the stronger establishment powers. This isn't a game of numbers necessarily. It's about who has the power, who has the bigger gun. That's an easy scapegoat whenever they want to go ahead and institute a new policy of monopolization or whatever it may be.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the other things that kind of fuel documentaries like this and the interest in it is, there's no doubt I've observed an underlying unconscious propensity towards quote unquote anti-Semitism in the mainstream way in which that term is conveyed. And I think anything which pours fuel on that just magnifies people so easily to want to be like, told you, it was them all along. They're the reason for all the ills of the world. They're the reason for all the pitfalls. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you read Mein Kampf from Hitler, I struggle with everything you need to see is in there to understand fully and wholly the ridiculousness, but then at the same time, the sophistication. And this is something that people don't want to give any attribution to, man, is that there are lots of strong, good points and well-made arguments by the Nazi side, including Hitler. And I think this is one of the reasons why it hasn't been confronted. Now, you do get certain individuals like Professor Chris Brown, who he likes to confront the information, but the overwhelming majority, they don't want to do that. They want to pretend that, oh, it's just evil, right? And like growing up, what do you actually learn about the arguments and the ideology? You don't learn anything. Do you know that it's about eugenics? Of course not. Instead, what you learn is, oh, just evil, horrible people, no moral compass. They just kill. And this is unrealistic. And so now what these idiots have done, the Holocaust establishment, because there really is a Holocaust establishment. For example, the Zionists, they were already working on a Holocaust memorial before the Holocaust had even ended, for the simple fact that they wanted to use it as a marketing gimmick, right? Again, that speaks to the different demographics. Like they were genuinely the same ideology in many aspects that dominated Nazism. It's going to sound antithetical, but it also dominates Zionism in many, many ways. They're very similar. This is even why some of the Nazis called themselves Zionists, because they had goals. I suppose that's a little bit different, but nonetheless, man, there's some strong arguments made ideologically. And if you read them and you aren't equipped mentally to deal with them or to address them, you are going to be sucked into it. And that's where the Holocaust establishment, whether deliberately or not deliberately, is completely erred, is that they haven't addressed this. And likely because it's difficult to address some of the criticisms that you will find in Mein Kampf and elsewhere.
Yo, Gavin, thank you for all that, man. I'm enjoying this conversation. People that are like, let's say, pro-Hitler or proponents of Hitler, very often they talk about that, he was defending German values. You brought it up earlier, how there's maybe some parallels between like the degeneracy of culture in society breaking down and the rise of, a nationalist individual. And so when you hear that, or based on your research, like, is there any truth to it that like, he was defending German values, or at the same time he was defending against communism? That's another argument people will say as well.
Yeah. Okay. So the thing is, first and foremost, right, in Hitler's mind, communism, or Marxism specifically, Marxism and the Jewish people, because he viewed Jews being predominantly more an ethnic composition rather than a religious one. Of course, it's two, which is where it gets a bit confusing, right? You get three distinct demographics of ethnic Jews. But for him, he conflated Marxism with Judaism, or just being Jewish. He actually doesn't really speak about Judaism. He speaks a lot about Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, in my view, he wasn't a very good person. He wasn't really a very good human being. Of course, there's a lot of people that will challenge that, and I'm always open to that. I haven't researched everything on the dude. But nonetheless, he viewed what was going on with Marxism as being an international Jew plot. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but in Germany, there were tens of thousands of people. They were called I think it was the Spartacuses, something along those lines, probably named after the uprising of Spartacus in ancient Rome, the slave who was a gladiator. Like, you've heard that famous story. It's somewhat in a fictional sense based on the Gladiator film, but this was the real dude. And there were tens of thousands of them, and they were led by Rosa Luxemburg and some prominent Jewish figures. And they wanted to actually wage a revolution in Germany. And the way this was put down was by former veterans of World War I, former German veterans. But in relation to, so yes, that's always been at the forefront of his mind. He's felt like what took place in Russia was going to now happen in Germany and worldwide. And he viewed it as being a Jewish plot. This is where it's significant.
Isn't that strange? Because like an objective view would show that Marxism and traditional quote unquote Jewish values are at complete odds. Even Marx, in fact, has an essay called The Jewish Question, right? In which he
he was an atheist.
Yeah,
he was an atheist. Well, you see, this is where Hitler, and this is where you have to also be able to not latch onto get completely absorbed into his worldview. And you need to recognize, like, a lot of the things you were saying. We also have the fortunate advantage of now being at a higher tip of the proverbial mountain information-wise. So we can dig into things that he may not necessarily have had access to. We also have to be sensitive to, not sensitive in an empathic way, like, for Hitler, not some shit like that, but we need to be sensitive and understanding more so, I should say, aware of his personal journey, which is he experienced something on the ground fundamentally different from everybody else. And so his view came to be that Judaism is a cover. That's what it is, a smokescreen. The Jews, they have dirty blood. Their blood is bad. And because of their blood, ethnically, they are only capable of evil. So he in fact retorted in Mein Kampf about, is this why they call the chosen people? Because essentially they're evil. They stink and they're evil and they're always plotting and they're always doing this and that. But this is where it's so important to have a wider knowledge and interest in terms of research. And Professor Andy Sutton's publication, and just his work period, because he's written several publications. In fact, he had an academic series on transferring technology from the US to the Soviet Union and communist Russia, how the US government predominantly actually built up the Soviet Union and communist Russia. And this is no slouch. Okay? His work was cited when he was still a professor at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, one of the most prestigious institutes in the world. His research was still, in fact, cited by the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his publication, I think it was Between Two Worlds, and then also the Council on Foreign Relations. These are elitist institutions. This, of course, is prior to him digging into the fact that Wall Street was playing such a massive role. But in there, he specifically details how the technology is coming in from Standard Oil, from high elitist companies, that these are not Jewish companies, not Jewish-owned companies. The Rockefellers, for example, and I made this very clear before, were above and beyond all else the main empowerers, not just militarily through fuel and through other means, and also they gave financial means, but also ideologically. Like the Rockefeller Foundation is what inculcated the eugenics research in Germany in a time when the scientific establishment was desperate for funds. They gave them the funds, but they dictated where the science would go. And so this is where it's so important to have a wider holistic point of view, because if you read Professor Andy Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, so the Bolshevik Revolution is the Communist Revolution. If you read that, and he's meticulous with his research, then you begin to see that, wow, yes, there were elitist Jews involved, right? Like Otto H. Korn, for example, but there were also elitist Anglo-Saxons and even Germans themselves, which is what the Rockefeller family is.
Yeah. This is the thing, man. It's like evil is beyond the collective. It's beyond the race. It's beyond the religion.
Just like good is. It's not rocket science. You know what I mean? Somebody is capable of doing good because that is just a chosen action, and it's part of their deeper moral being, which is the result of many factors, one of which is your personal experience and journey on this planet, amongst other things. And then it's the same true of people who are doing evil things. If you look at evil historically, there's always some kind of underlying causative factor behind it. Even the repression that has been done in incidents of legitimate genocides. So you look at Rwanda with the Tutsis and the Hutu, I think it was. What happens? Well, there was a colonial administration. They took the minority of the demographic. They empowered them to have control of the others. Naturally, human beings, doesn't matter your skin color. If you put in a position to abuse your power, oftentimes that's what happens, and you dehumanize people. Excuse me. I think it was the Stanford prison experiment that detailed this. Doesn't mean humiliation is evil. It's another complex topic. Fundamentally, children are not evil, but we can be conditioned to have our repressed anger directed in a very weaponized and horrible way. But you look at what happened over there, what happens? The people that are oppressed, they become the oppressors. Just like a child that gets abused can become the abuser. Now, that's not always the case. I myself had a crazy childhood upbringing, but I didn't go down that path. But naturally, we do know we have enough research to corroborate that this is just introductory psychology. We may not agree with it. It might not feel good, but that is the case. And so also what's even happening now with much of the Jewish culture in Israel, they who have been legitimately repressed, now they are going ahead and repressing the Palestinian people in an untenable way. Yeah. And people think this is just antithetical. No, it's just, innocent Israel, And there's many facets within what constitutes Israel and the Zionist leadership. And at the highest levels, from the beginning, they didn't give two shits about the average Jew in that was being subjected to Nazi persecution. They were more concerned with just developing a state and using the statistics of what was happening in Nazi Germany for that purpose.
Based on your research, one of the main arguments with people that challenge the official narrative around the Holocaust is the number 6 million, 6 million Jews, that perished during that time. Like, do you think that any people that are challenging this, that there's any, truth behind it, or like, what are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts first and foremost on challenging anything is that it needs to be done openly, because I'm a firm believer the way forward collectively as a society is that we have to have respectful debates. You know what I mean? I really enjoyed when you had David and I on the podcast, because then we can have a sensible confrontation, and then you have a divergence of knowledge, and it actually fast tracks people's awareness. So you have the awareness of one person, the awareness of another, you put them together, what happens? It just expands.
Everyone benefits when it's done properly.
Exactly, when it's done properly. Yeah. Unlike the establishment media, which what do? They give us shouting matches. And this, in fact, is a form of brainwashing, because now, we have mirror neurons. It's part of our biology. We tend to reflect on one level or another something that we think. So when you're watching a really intense movie, you can be like on the edge of your seat because biologically you're feeling some of that. So when we watch that and we have this screaming stuff, it starts to inculcate, this is how it's going to go if you have this conversation. Don't have this conversation, because this shit will happen to you. So we need to have more we need to have more sensible discussions surrounding these topics. But in relation to the figure, we do need to understand fully and wholly that it's an approximate figure, right? It's not set in stone. However, there's people that claim that it's actually could be undervalued, that number. What's even more interesting is that 6 million figure is so well known, but did you know that it's estimated, I think 14 or 15 million Slavic people, Slavs, were also targeted for mass murder. They call it sometimes a forgotten genocide. Now, when I look into the mass murder and stuff and the documentation, because one of the big things as well is they say there's a lack of documentation. There's actually quite a lot of documentation. There's no express order from Hitler, but of course this is not unusual. Even with what happened with the Nakba, with the Zionists, there's no express order, because it's so incriminating that unless it's rookie hour, rookie, go get your milk and cookie. Unless it's rookie hour, they're not going to do that kind of shit. But in relation to how the decision-making process was made, there's a guy by the name of Professor Christopher Brown. He's done quite a good job at detailing the kind of decision-making process of the larger Nazi structure. Hitler, in fact, tended to prefer to relegate his task. He actually spoke about it where he said, my favorite people are the people who I can just entrust them to do their own thing. I can give them the hints and they just get it done. But in terms of the figure, I think that we should question it. And I don't think there's any bad... For me, it's like this, man. The more we can even the playing field out, whether that's done by empowering people to psychologically wage some kind of war, because this is a massive mental battlefield, or physically, right? Arming people, instructing them on how to utilize guns and so on. Because the average human being is a decent human being. And it's always a minority that has a monopoly on violence, a monopoly on information, and they then weaponize that violence or that information. If we can even out the playing field to a more moral people, I just see it as being beneficial, man. So am I sure about that specific number? No. Based on what I have looked into, do I believe there were mass executions? Yes, I do. But I think we should always question, man. History is a story ultimately. And especially the more you go into it and the more emotional the events, the more significant it is to just look into it. But it's tricky. We have to be aware of our own bullshit and our own prejudices, because we all have them. Like me, I have a prejudice against cops. It is what it is. I just do. And so I have to be mindful of that I can be a little bit over the top sometimes and looking for shit, or with politicians, period. Now, there's a reason for that. But of course, if you talk to the average person that's legitimately a racist, they actually have reasons, maybe based on personal experience, that to them are legitimate. So we have to be mindful of how our own keyhole perception, because we've all got a limited perception, how that can potentially influence our pursuit of objective truth and then adjust accordingly.
Yeah, well, the reason I brought up that number 6 million is just because I've heard before in conversations and I've seen online that number 6 million as a symbol had been highlighted pre-World War II,
Oh,
in
yeah.
the 19th century,
Oh,
and the
yeah.
20th century, about the plight of 6 million Jews, or there's been newspaper articles talking about 6
100%,
million
yeah.
Jews. So it's like interesting that that's like the number.
Yeah, it is very interesting. So that actually is highlighted, I think, in both of those documentaries. And when you see it, it is very eerie. It's very strange. However, there are also different figures that have been omitted. So various figures that have been thrown out in publications prior to that. But of course, the consistency and the repetition with the 6 million figure does make you wonder. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I hate to speculate, but I suppose one of the benefits of doing this kind of podcast, and you guys have an awesome community, is that more people can look at it, right? And more minds, like the expression goes, many hands make light work, many minds do the same thing. Hopefully, earnest, truth-seeking minds. But I think that also corroborated somehow, some way, with some kind of scripture or prophecy. And so that can lend credence to this notion, right? A lot of what's going on, for example, with Israel, where it gets this like free pass to just act batshit crazy and do genocidal, insane, Nazi-like things, is the Christian Zionist demographic. Oh, in the Bible, it's written 1948, there's going to be this war, and they're going to be surrounded by this powerful force, when the reality is that the Arab force was far weaker than the Israeli force, who were receiving massive amounts of arms and so on. They were a far superior force militarily. But all of this happened, it's biblical. And so because of that, I didn't have to actually do research. I just impulsively believe it because it's prophetic.
Yeah. And I want to highlight too, I know we've highlighted on previous episodes and we talk about it often, but just a reminder to our audience, what the name of this podcast is. Like, we're here for the truth. We're not sitting here saying, okay, Gavin has all the answers to everything, or Joel does, or I do. Like, we're here to have a dialogue. We're here to have a conversation. We're here to express something that many people are even afraid to look into or to express. And so, take this, digest it, continue to read, continue to investigate, and come to your own conclusions,
Yeah, 100%, man. And I love that you actually put that out there. If I can just season that with the following. This topic is so incredibly and profoundly complex that it is going to require a collective effort. And we have to try again to be mindful of our own prejudices, and always also be mindful that there's things that we don't know. It's inescapable. We're all ignorant in one way or another. Ignorance is just a dirty word for unawareness. And so for myself as well, part of wanting to do this podcast is that I want more people to join in this discussion, man, because it has not been handled correctly on both sides. So on the one side, it's authoritarianism and it's intimidation and name calling. Oh, you're an anti-Semite if you don't agree. That's not how you do things. You don't shout people down, man. If you have a child and your child wants to know something, you start telling them how stupid they are, and of course not. You're going to traumatize them. They're not going to want to speak about it ever. And guess what? Whatever happens when a sophisticated argument comes along, they're going to be mentally unprepared and unequipped. And then on the other side, it's going underground with yeah, man, that's what's going on. They're evil, and all the Nazi, all the Jewish people, and Einstein, and it's just like never ending. It just snowballs and snowballs. And then the communists, they're all Jews, and then it becomes essentially an echo of what Hitler had. And so there needs to be these two sides as well, need to converge with a recognition we have a collective, we have shared human principles, right? We're always divided by our perceptions, but we have shared unifying human principles, namely that we actually want to be aligned with objective reality and there for the truth. But that's only going to happen when more and more people join in this discussion.
We all need to observe the appeal of the simplistic answers,
100%, man. So that expression that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication? So me, I'll take it a step further and say simplicity is the ultimate form of truth. And the only way that simplicity comes around is when you sit with something for long enough that you can start to come up with some more simple answers. Whenever it's complex, whenever it's ambiguous, we need to recognize that there's either ignorance there or deception, neither of which are good for humanity.
Yeah, I consider these conversations like in a process of excavation, right?
100%.
In the hope that through these conversations and also through our own inherent intuition and honed discernment as human beings, that ultimately the underlying foundation of truth is going to begin to get uncovered and the dust is going to be wiped off and it's going to begin to shine through, but the conversations, aka the excavation, has to be had. And it just seems like the excavation
And we
on
need
this,
to pile
this
more
particular
sand on that
topic.
shit. Oh, let's throw more sand on it. Let's cover it up more. I mean,
No,
really?
many people are throwing more sand on it with
Oh,
black and
100%.
white, simplistic, nuance lacking.
People are throwing
conclusions.
cement on that shit, man.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's you know, everybody
Yeah.
everybody claims to love the truth without even knowing what that means. So objective reality, but objective reality is difficult. You know,
Yeah.
it was the Japanese fighter and philosopher, I can't remember his name, I'm not going to butcher it, but Miniyama Munosaki or whatever his name was, a skilled practitioner at the art of war and psychological warfare, that basically said that, at least it's been attributed to him, that the truth is what it is. We must bend to its power or we live a lie. And what that means is that the reality, objective reality, it is what it is. And we can try to bend it to our narrow-minded little perceptions, but then we're living a lie.
Yeah. And the objective reality, without doubt, obviously, is that there's two sides to the equation. There's two sides to the story. We've all been indoctrinated and educated in a way that is not true, to be, to have a very one-sided perspective of what happened during World War II, and also have a very one-sided perspective of, England, America, good guys, Churchill, like saints,
And the stuff they did was evil as well. And the Soviet Union, another thing, for example, there was the, damn it, I can't remember the name of it now, but there was a particular mass murder carried out by Soviet troops where they killed upwards of 20,000 Polish civilians or POWs, I can't specifically remember, and then they blamed it on the Nazis. So there's many elements going on here that have to be investigated objectively to ascertain the truth.
Yeah. So I guess, you went through the lengthy process of researching these documentaries and, coming to, I guess, your own truth discovery process in this. What are some of the main?
I want to make it very clear then to everybody listening. I'm still in very early stages. I've done a lot of research over many, many years, guys, and I can tell you right now, I've just got my toe in the water with this.
Okay. Well, so far, what are some of the main fallacies from the, super pro Hitler camp presented in these documentaries are you finding?
The one that's a bit more efficient is the Greatest Story Never Told, but the lengthier one, right? And people tend to confuse truth because, again, we haven't been provided with an authentic understanding, because I think philosophically people don't really know themselves, right? Very few people have sat down and truly contemplated, like, what is truth? What does that even fundamentally mean? And again, the best way I define it is just a subjective reality, right? And sometimes people can use it in an expressive way and say, oh, that's the truth, which can necessarily represent that that's the highest awareness that we can ascertain of reality in this particular regard. But for example, the Europa, the Final Stand, man, there are so many discrepancies in there that it's quite mountainous. But then there's some really powerful truth, which is what makes it very challenging and tricky. But I think the notion of, like the meeting at Jekyll Island, this was the Jews. No, this is demonstrably false. And how do we know that? Because we can corroborate it with objective reality. And the objective reality, therefore, is indicative of the truth. And, they take it to extraordinary lengths, man. And Joseph Stalin, he becomes a Jew. Like I said, introductory knowledge is thrust on his head. So Vladimir Jabotinsky, he's a communist, he's a Marxist. The dude hated Marxism. He was a fascist, right? He had a Zionist military Jewish school called the Bataan Naval Academy under Mussolini. Mussolini called him a fascist. There were Jewish youth that joined Mussolini's army. That's a whole entire different chapter that people aren't aware of.
Hey, Gavin,
So
real quickly, man, just because this word's being thrown around so often these days, can you just define what a fascist is?
Yeah. Thank you so much. So this is another thing, and I'm so glad that you asked that, man, because, man, philosophically, we have to really sit down and try to dig into the meat and potatoes, the proverbial meat and potatoes of what even words mean, because so many words are ambiguous and they have many meanings to many different people. Capitalism, fascism, communism, these things mean 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. Fascism, as I would define it, right, based on my research, and this is something that was very dominant during this period, not just amongst the Nazis or in Spain under Franco or the Italians, or the Zionists. The Zionists were very much fascist in the ideology, which is strange. Zionism was something kind of unique because they were also dominated by radical Marxists that first immigrated there early on, which is another story. But fascism essentially is, there's a people, right? And this people, and this is where it starts to converge as well with current events. There's a people culturally that feel like they've been castrated, so to speak. So they can't have pride anymore. They've been beaten down. This, in the case of Germany, largely as a result of World War I. And then, of course, the proverbial vultures come in, and then they start to feed off the backs of the downtrodden masses. And so it becomes this emergence of pride where you have an ideology that says no. So if you look at Zionism, for example, people think that it's about, and this is again the innocence and ignorance of the Christian Zionists, that the Zionists were inspired by the Bible or the Torah, by these ancient scriptures. No, the overwhelming majority of the founding fathers did not believe in any way in religion. They thought it was childish and foolish. Instead, where they found their sense of identity was, for example, the rebellions against the Roman Empire by the Jews. They did find some strength in the stories of King David's empire, but it was all more nationalistic. So fascism is very nationalistic in its character, and it starts to shape people around this nationalistic empowering image. And then it also highlights intensely that you need to keep this national demographic here. You can't allow alien elements, whether that's literally through blood or immigration, to come in, because they are going to convolute and they are going to go ahead and degrade this strength that we have. And that's why it's something that's going on in America. That's why people who have looked a bit into it see that. Then, of course, there's also the notion that it's about centralizing more authority, doing it also not just under government institutions, but also with corporate institutions, and not stopping there. You can now absorb the church. Every institution needs to be somewhat centralized. And there also is a militancy behind it. Now, the interesting thing about all of these different things is I myself can be in agreement with much of it, but then you need to see how they carry out these policies. It's very authoritarian. It's very repressive. And again, there's certain fundamentals, foundational principles that doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right, or you don't give a shit about any of that stuff like I never used to when I was in my 20s. I only started learning about like these fundamental distinctions in politics, and it's a whole entire different language that's going on right in front of us, and most people just don't understand it because it's inverting reality and therefore the truth. But, oh man, I actually lost my train of thought there. Can somebody give me a refresher?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry,
I mean, from my perspective,
man.
like if you go through some of the major tenets of fascism, you'll find that the same things apply to socialism, And so it's so interesting when people consider these things, when people consider these things to be opposites, like suppression of political dissent. Right? How
100%, man.
Opposition of free speech.
Oh, no, but all of it, it's the same. It's just dressed up in different ways. So it's like you take an original song, right? Because both of these ideologies are rooted in elitism. Just like eugenics was rooted in elitism, just like Malthusianism rooted in elitism. But they're remixes. You know how you get these people these days, they make a song and it's just a remix. But it's something that preceded it. And so they do the same thing. They've got the same foundational principles. And this is oftentimes why I actually try my best not to get too wrapped up, and even I can get baited into it by this is fascist, this is communist, because A, it's semantics. There's different definitions depending on what propagandist is behind it. And then B, they are very similar in their ideologies, that if we just instead focus on fundamentally it's wrong to repress people, to engage in censorship, and focus on that, I feel like irrespective of however people have been indoctrinated, they can understand, yes, that is fundamentally wrong. And then we can find some kind of unifying mutual grounds.
Yeah. I think like the majority, when they think of fascism, they think of like extreme nationalism, and I think that's why today you have people just throwing the fascist label out. It's like, we elected a fascist. The fascist is now the president of the United States. He's a fascist, And again,
North Korea.
Trump. What do you say?
Like North Korea.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to see how like these labels and these words just become the go-to to
I
throw.
mean, they're meant to be dismissive, man. Again, how I was saying we have like these proverbial file cabinets in our subconscious, and people love to find something new, label it, and throw it in there because then they don't have to think. Trump is something different. You know what I mean? Yes, there are elements of fascism there, but again, it's different. It's not one size fits all. That's just not how reality works. If that was the case, one of the things that emerged, for example, during the protests on the school campuses with the students over what's going on with Israel, and yes, a lot of them they caught up in the emotional intoxication of everything and they aren't particularly informed. It doesn't denote the integrity or the significance of opposing the Israeli Zionist state for those who are well informed. One of the things was, George Soros, he was connected to some of the funding. And also during the so-called scandemic, where there was the Great Barrington Declaration, you have tens of thousands of doctors and scientists that are saying, no, this is dangerous, it's deadly, we can't do lockdowns. Oh, but because they were attached to an institute that had received funding from the Koch brothers, now we can dismiss it. That's lazy means of thinking. And if that was the case, well, guess what? Then all of these elitists, all they're going to do is they're going to finance sources of the truth because they know you'll just dismiss it. So any form of dismissive thinking, including the weaponization of labels, right? So on the one end, it's fascism. On the other end, it's anti-Semitism. It's bullshit. Anybody that has the capability to critically think needs to sit down, try to eliminate the background noise to the best of your capability. One of the things I also really don't like about those documentaries on Hitler and the Nazis, man, is they got like this music and here comes Hitler and it's all of that shit to me it's so silly, man. Just give me the objective evidence, let me assess it for myself. And so, but people need to be very sensitive to this, right? Like you need to recognize the plethora of ways in which your emotions can be antagonized, manipulated, maneuvered, and then you try to have to compensate with that and take the information to as quiet a place as you possibly can. So that's just your mind. Your mind is also, it takes a while to shut it down. Not entirely, you got to still use your critical thinking, but then you sit down with that information, not music, not people screaming, not this shit, that shit. And you sit there and then you really start to say, okay, I have a question about that. Let me go research that question. We're in a very fortunate, gifted, incredible age in which we can investigate things. Now, it's tricky because as the saying goes, we are drowning in information that starves for knowledge. But if you dig deep enough, meticulously enough, then eventually you can begin to illuminate some of this dark shit.
Yeah.
Human beings are so complex. As if like there's one person like going, ooh, let me go check the fascist playbook for my next decision. And that's the only decision possible to me. Let me go check my Marxist socialist playbook. And that's the only decision
100%.
possible to me. Like reality is like always offering different things for
100%.
different answers. And while there might be a baseline kind of driver, ideology driving one's decision-making processes, it's not like it's so concrete where it's like, this is what I have to follow.
Yeah, these people are very practical, man. At the highest levels, they are pragmatists, which is to say, what works. They don't give a shit what it is.
Yeah.
It's what works. As simple as that. But go ahead, Erasmus, before I go.
Well, no, I was just going to highlight just that common phrase, like history is written by the victors. And so you have to take
we
that.
need to be mindful of that. Yep.
Who's Victor?
You have to definitely have to be mindful of that because it's like, what stories have been told, what mythology has been put forth, to support.
Well, I think, what I think is also significant that just occurred to me now. I had a little aha moment. I mean, we're all aware of it, but to have it correspond with that expression that victory is written by the winners, which that
history.
No, history is written by, like I said, I think it must.
There's a bunch of men named Victor in a room somewhere, just writing all the history books.
All right, but
that'd be a funny skit. Victor, what do you think? Well, Victor, I think this. Victor, what do you think happened in? Anyway, sorry, continue, Gavin.
No, it's all good, man. It's also like, for example, if you look at Germany after World War I, there's also mythology that's inculcated that's not necessarily pertains to the victors, but like then there'll be mythology, we lost because of this, and this, right? And I suppose it still corresponds with the winners of the proverbial war, which is always a war actually against the masses of the common people. Because even the existing administration, I suppose, in the wake of the war in the opposite country is going to be subservient to the new one, like the vassal state. So, yeah, history is written by the victors. And just very quickly to speak to that, we need to be mindful of that. However, we again can't engage in lazy forms of thinking where people say, oh, but because the victors won, the victors were really the bad guys. Sometimes it's just that you get a bad guy and you get a worse guy. You know what I mean? It's kind of like elections. It's choosing between two evils.
In regards to World War II, I've heard it stated that we are living in a movie in which the bad guys won, and we've all been propagandized to believe they're the good guys.
So what I'll say to that, man, is 100% the bad guys did win, but not in the way that people think. Again, as I stated with what took place with Hitler, this is based on my research. To me, Hitler was the ultimate boogeyman. He was the ultimate patsy. And so he was utilized to usher in what we now see as this very globalized, centralized governing structure. We've got the United Nations, you've got the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, NATO, the largest military alliance in history, the Department of Defense, and several hundred military bases worldwide, and just so many other aspects. That was a brilliant chess move on part of the globalist establishment. And they were the ones that built up. Well, I maintain that we wouldn't even know who Hitler was today, historically and worldwide, had it not been for the international powers, which included elitist Jews like the Rothschild family through Royal Dutch Shell. They were the largest shareholders at that time. But without their patronage, we wouldn't know who that dude is. And we also need to recognize that the elitists, especially the royal families, they loved the Nazis. They loved Hitler. The dude who passed away, Queen Elizabeth's husband, Prince, what was that dude's name? Prince Philip.
Philip,
Yeah, Prince Philip. That's him, yeah. And you see that dude, he just looks like he's dead now, but you see that he looks like a straight up vampire, man. He looks like something out of a friggin' horror movie. But his three sisters were all married to high-ranking Nazis. When he came over to marry the Queen of England, his family was actually, they weren't allowed to come because public opinion was so vehemently opposed to it. He changed his name. He had a Germanic name, just like the royals, the so-called House of Windsor, changed their name from Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha. So to today, they used to be, what was it? Battenberg, I think was the name. They changed it to Mountbatten to sound more English. But they all loved Nazi Germany. I mean, we also know about that video of the Queen when she's a little child doing the Nazi salute. So, I mean, it's very complex, but I would say, yes, 100% that the bad guys have won and we are living in their world. But it's not that the good guys lost. It was just a power struggle as I foresee it. And Hitler, he was a true believer, man. I have no reservations about that, man. I really believe he was a true believer. But like many other people who are conditioned in an unconscious way, they're not even fully aware of the forces that are kind of engineering their minds, something that Edward Bernays wrote about quite thoroughly in his book, Propaganda. And propaganda, he wasn't trying to say, oh, there's propaganda, learn about it. It was this back then, propaganda was public relations. It only got a dirty name later on. But he basically said there's always a hidden hand that's shaping the minds of the public. And so the same was true of Hitler. If you look at who influenced him culturally, ideologically, Madison Grant, chief among them, who he called his book, The Passing of the Great Race, his Bible. If you look at the leading figures who influenced him, these were people with devout eugenics. And so naturally, when you start to subscribe, we know today, for example, eugenics is, of course, what espoused scientific racism. We know today, for example, that these things were totally incorrect, right? But that was the leading historians, leading scientists, leading anthropologists, and so on, and politicians and presidents, and laws were passed everywhere to go ahead and enshrine this. But then Hitler, he adopts this stuff. This has a major influence on him. Of course, he probably also didn't know that the Rockefeller Foundation, where the primary sponsors, people can read about this in terms of sources and citations from Professor Stefan Kuhl, is the earliest source I know about. I think it's page 20. Let's see how good I am. It's either page 10 or page 20, where he talks about how the Rockefeller Foundation, through his book called The Nazi Connection, and this is an academic, right? This is a mainstream establishment historian, so it's not controversial to cite him. The establishment has been very quiet about this stuff, and the Rockefellers, of course, have never had to been called to task for the things they did. But I'm sure Hitler didn't know that the Rockefeller Foundation, the primary sponsors of the institution that became the heart of the Nazi Germany program in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which is today the Max Planck Institute. And so, yes, I do believe that the bad guys won, but I don't think that Hitler and the Nazis were good guys. I think from his perspective and their perspective, they were the good guys because they believed in eugenics, which is that you have to preserve your racial purity. But if you're genuinely a good guy, which I tend to gauge this and measure this based on human principles, right? Integrity, humanity, just introductory things which we know on a deeper level to be right. You look at, let's say, the T4 program, the euthanasia program, or the hundreds of thousands of Germans that were sterilized simply because they were considered to be unfit. I mean, you can go look up the propaganda they put out. Oh, there'd be a weak person and, maybe it's an elderly person and they're on disability. And then they would say, oh, this person is a weight on you. That's your money. Your money's going to this person. And so they came up with this plan to involuntarily euthanize people and also sterilize very large numbers of people. That's not a good guy. You know what I mean? Or the unethical experiments that were conducted, and they were really conducted. Many of these scientists then went to the CIA infamously through the rat lines and through Operation Paperclip. Some of them went to the Mossad, like Otto Skorzeny, infamous assassin, one of Hitler's favorite assassins. And then they go and they continue their horrible shit that they did, like in MK Ultra. When MK Ultra really started to gear up and Project Artichoke and stuff and start to focus on doing these insane, unethical experiments, is when the Nazis started to get recruited.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's obviously not the behavior of the good guys, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I was just confirming, Prince Philip's real last name is Schleswig Holstein Sonderburg Luxembourg.
Gee.
It's a long last name.
So is that now the original one?
That's his real last name at birth, later changed to Battenberg. But get this.
Oh, Battenberg. But
Typical-
it's Battenberg. But then it became, just so I want to make sure that I got this right, man. And then it became
Mountbatten,
right?
Mountbatten, yeah.
Okay.
And get this, no surprise here. Originally, he was Prince Philippos of Greece, born on the Greek island of Corfu. His full name in Greek, Philippos Endrior. So, no surprise of the Greeks with the nefarious involvement.
And I mean, look, the thing we need to understand, you always get this expression about crypto Jews and I can't remember that one guy's name, but he's like the popular boogeyman now. He was a Jewish guy. He's very depraved and he kind of clandestinely inserted his depravity, and people tend to point to him oftentimes as being, the person who, this is on the other side of the argument, that degraded and uses the Jewish culture as a smokescreen to inculcate his own kind of evil ideology and so on. People don't realize, man, is the so-called royal family, they've been doing this shit for centuries. They've been doing it for so long, where they just changed their names. They changed their ideologies. Like he was allegedly, I think, on the surface, because they, like Machiavelli spoke about, you have to present yourself in a particular regard. So Prince Philip, this dude, he presented himself, I think, in Greece as being a Catholic. Well, then he comes over to Britain, where they've got a different mythology that they believe in, which is Protestantism, and I think it's specifically the Anglican Church. I can't recall off the top of my head now. But then he goes over there, and then they start having a propaganda campaign about, when he was in Greece, he was always inwardly really Protestant. He wasn't actually a Catholic. And that's how they are. They're just shape-shifting shits. You know what I mean? Like, they have no allegiance to anything except elitism.
Exactly, man. They'll take whatever guys works.
100%. So the House of Windsor, that they changed their name to from Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, which is German. They changed it during World War I. When that propaganda campaign, that massive propaganda campaign, was coming from Wellington House in the UK, which they sanctioned, that they were very much aware of, and also the Committee on Public Information in the US. So there's no allegiance for them to the average German person back then who was getting thrown under the bus, because it's about elitism. They know these things are constructs largely. And so they don't give a shit about anything other than its utility as a means of population control.
Yeah. It's like, we're going to sell the Germans as the bad guys. You all better change your last names for the next phase, Yeah,
boom. That's it. I mean, and they simply don't care, man. Even now, I didn't know that it goes back to an earlier progenitor. And that's how these so-called royal families are, man. You trace them and they go back further and further and further. And that's only what we have records for. So if you take a look again at the House of Windsor, Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, then that goes to the House of Wettin, W-E-W-T-I-N, I think it is. That's like from the 9th century or something. These people's sole occupation for centuries and centuries and centuries, for over 1,000 years, has been how do we rule people and exploit them? Which most people are not going to be receptive to. So what do you have to do? You have to be an expert in deception. Another thing we have to be mindful of, know your enemy.
Yeah. Well, back to World War II, I'm curious your thoughts on this. I'm pretty sure there were high-ranking Nazi officials like Mengele, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Joseph Mengele, and Eichmann, I believe, and some others that escaped to South America. And there's some theories that potentially Adolf Hitler also escaped and he didn't commit suicide in his bunker. And I'm curious, like, what you think.
I think it's fully probable. So I don't know for sure, but I think it's fully probable.
There's so many German South Americans that I know.
Look, we know that there was in fact also colonies in South America. There was one where there were like culture going on and pedophilia and stuff. If I remember correctly, please everybody just maybe.
I think there was like a big German population, and I could be wrong. Like pre-World War II in South America, like I've heard stories of certain places. I don't know if it's Brazil or Argentina, where it's like everyone has like blonde hair and blue eyes.
Well, what's really interesting is
Chile too.
Yeah. Well, look, what's very interesting, right? And this is something that I wrote about in my publication, The History of Elitism, World Government and Population Control, because I try to zoom out and see, like, what's the bigger thing that's going on here? Because Hitler, man, yes, he was a big fish in a certain way, in a certain demographic, but on the global stage, he's a bit of a smaller fish compared to the big boys, the big players. And what happened with the proverbial Nazi rat line, so this is what funneled them to South America, right? And there were other programs. I mean, virtually every major government took in Nazis. Like I said, even the Israeli Mossad utilized Otto Skorzeny, who this dude was an unrepentant Nazi. He was a very formidable assassin. He actually rescued Mussolini. But what happens in South America is they get funneled there, right? So you got like Walter Ralph, Klaus Barbie. These people are notorious for being like ruthless killers and mass murderers. What do? Well, they go to South America and they start serving and working with the dictatorships in South America. Who helped to kickstart those dictatorships? Well, if we take a look at Operation Condor, which is the larger operation, and then the original 9/11, the 1973 coup d'etat that overthrew President Salvador Allende in Chile, I believe it was. If we see who was behind that, it was the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. government. So the people that absolved the Nazis of their wrongdoing, for example, Allen Dulles, he was a key figure. He also he was the head of the CIA under MK Ultra and much of the recruiting process of the Nazis. He was key in the rat lines. This dude was a Council on Foreign Relations member as well. So the CFR, which very few people know about, but that's the real seat of power in the United States. That's the one that directs and guides the U.S. government. So through Sullivan and Cromwell as well, and I suppose let me slow down because there's so much information to give off and digest for the listeners and the viewers. But he helped to also finance, facilitate, and arm the Nazis. This is what Sullivan and Cromwell. So him and his brother, John Foster Dulles. And then at the same time, what do? They help the Nazis escape to South America. Well, then the CIA plays a key role simultaneously in propping up these South American dictatorships. And it's still a larger global enterprise. Also, if you look closely, what do you find? You find the Nazis were involved in something called Operation Gladio in Europe. This is when there were false flag attacks in mass committed by governments, but the governments were blaming communists and the left, when in fact they actually had people on their payroll. Very complex structure. If you look at Operation Gladio specifically in Italy, they had Freemasons, the Vatican Church was involved. I mean, all kinds of different figures. And they literally committed false flag terror events. And then what would they say? Oh, we need to centralize more power and control, and we should join NATO. So what do you start to see? You see the emergence of a sophisticated plan to centralize more power and more control. So yes, what happened with South America, it's very possible that Hitler may have in fact gone there because so many figures did. And what did they do? They served the larger global establishments. And even just very quickly, a lot of the high-profile Nazis, they were absolved of criminal wrongdoing at the Nuremberg trials. People that for sure people who thought would be sentenced to death. They were absolved by the High Commissioner to Germany at that time, which was Alfred McCloy. Alfred McCloy was another big boy elitist, head of the Rockefeller Foundation. And at one time, he was also the chair, and he was, I think, a lifelong member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So behind the scenes, behind the most evocative things, it's quite basic now that people know whenever there's something really loud, we need to ask, what are they trying to distract you from? That applies to history as well. And there are very, very shadowy figures behind the ascension of Hitler and the Nazis that have been like severely understudied.
Yeah, definitely, man. If you end up, I'll send you the article. If you end up looking into what's his name? Yeah, Greg Hallett's work and Henry Mackay's work. There's so many decisions that Hitler made along the way where it's like, you know, that don't really align with the supposed intentions, you know. For example, some of the hypothesis, if I can read, is why Hitler was able to expand into Rhineland without fear of retaliation. Why the Nazis?
He was permitted, brother.
Yeah.
Look, if you read Tragedy and Hope from, again, Professor Carol Quigley, they allowed him to get built up. And it was the Round Table Group. And the significant, just very quickly, the Round Table Group and the Council on Foreign Relations were working together. That's very significant to know.
Yeah. Why Hitler never sealed the Mediterranean at Gibraltar, and why the Spanish dictator Franco remained neutral despite the huge debt he owed the Nazis from the Civil War. Why IG Farben headquarters in Frankfurt was never bombed and then became CIA headquarters.
And listen, and it's not just IG Farben. There were many locations that were supplying ITT, and I think it was Sosthenes Ben, if I remember his name correctly. A lot of these people were awarded by both the US and the Nazi governments, man, which is wild. ITT and IBM.
Yeah.
Their locations, which, you could have just bombed it and you could have taken out this infrastructure that's supplying the Nazis, but they didn't do it.
Yeah.
And it's key to also mention that significant and key officials within the administration of Roosevelt, although that's another thing in the documentary, they're all Jews, was also high-ranking figures from the Council of Foreign Relations. Rockefellers were also playing a key role in it. All five Rockefeller brothers played key roles in intelligence during World War II.
So many questions, man. So many questions. Apparently, the Bank of England rewarded Hitler for taking Prague by giving him the checkered gold reserves that were held in London.
I would not be surprised. I don't know about that, but I wouldn't be surprised. If you look at the Bank of International Settlements.
This is all according to this one person's research.
This is all according to, Greg Hallett's research. And the book is called Hitler Was a British Agent. And he goes into even like that Hitler was a Tavistock product too.
The Tavistock
came across that website once.
Very interesting thing too. Tavistock Institute, very much a Rockefeller-funded creation, man. Yeah, what was I going to say now? Is something significant. Let me try to... I can't remember.
Oh, good,
yeah, but, I think that it's very... yes, what I was going to say is the Bank of International Settlements, which, Professor Carol Quigley considered that the central bank of central banks. So the shareholders, if I'm not mistaken, in the Bank of International Settlements is the central banks around the world. At that time, guess who was the head of the Bank of International Settlements? If I recall correctly, it was a Nazi. So also this notion that Nazis were entirely against globalism is not true. That was a different brand of globalism. They wanted to spread it globally, but they just had their own way and means of doing it. So if you look at the Bank of International Settlements, they also, there were Nazis working within the Bank of International Settlements in high-ranking positions at that time, and the Bank of International Settlements was also involved and implicated in basically siphoning off wealth and taking illegal gold. And then the Federal Reserve got involved, and it was a massive criminal enterprise, man. And that one of the things for like the Nazi apologists is that they don't dig into these other connections, like how they were connected to the Bank of International Settlements, or how they connected to the Rockefellers, or this kind of the globalist establishment. That's very significant. Everything needs to be addressed, man. The way that you address something that you think that you don't agree with, you think it's deception or ignorance, is with knowledge, right? You don't like highlight only what you, no, look at this. No, the best thing to do is confront everything to the best of your capability, right? And within the realm of reason. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, the MO for the longest time has been anything to continue to foment conflict and keep humanity in this kind of whirlwind days and this thrall. And I truly believe and feel that we're moving into an age where that level of outright deception is becoming a lot harder. And the terms of engagement when it comes to fomenting this war and this conflict against humanity, it's shifted. People talk about fifth generation warfare, information warfare.
It's always going to evolve.
Yeah,
100%.
Things of that nature, etc. But, except in this playing ground, the primary weapons of war are also in humanity's hand. And that is information, that is the internet, that is our own minds and our capability to research and access to the research. So I think it's more of an even playing field than it ever has been. And I'm curious, man, as you mentioned, as more minds come to place, their energy and their focus on topics like this, what is going to be unraveled as time
100%.
proceeds? To what extent have we been deceived? Like, even with this conversation, I know that we're barely fucking scratching the surface of what really, really could have possibly gone on,
But you see, this is also the significance is that we, I don't know, for the longest time, I've had this kind of moral sense of duty and awareness that what we're doing is we are contributing. There's that expression, that proverb, that he who plants a tree, that he will not sit in its shade, but safe that his ancestors, his children will sit in that shade and get fruit from that tree, understands the meaning of life. To me, that is the meaning of life. Humanity is what I fight for. That's kind of the kingdom that I view. It's an intangible one. It's one of principles.
Yeah.
And I do believe in the inherent goodness of human beings. And that's not to say they aren't psychopaths and so on, but it's a small minority. And I do believe if we can equip people mentally and physically in the means of being formidable at defending themselves, it'll even up the playing field. Like I was saying earlier, there's always a monopoly by a minority on violence, on information, and what do? They can use that to their advantage to weaponize it. But as the playing field gets evened out, I see that tipping scale change. In fact, I view what they are doing, even with transhumanism and all these other things, which are so scary to so many people, what they in fact do indirectly, and I'm not saying it's necessary. I don't think suffering is absolutely essential. I think there's other ways. It's like if you have a child, you don't have to make them suffer to teach them. You can do it in a more intelligent way. And I think we'll get there. I think we're coming out of the proverbial cave still, so we don't fully understand it. And we've suffered for so long, and we try to find as much meaning as we can, not recognizing it's not necessarily fundamental. But, as we go through this suffering process and we kind of get reborn and they force us into these difficulties, I think it indirectly also has the outcome of actually pushing us towards evolving and learning about ourselves. So, I can't reach for all of these external distractions. I have to reach internally, because this is where I'm going to find the wellspring of strength that I need. And unfortunately, a lot of people along the way aren't going to be able to cope. It's, there's lots of difficulty that's ahead. But I am a firm believer we are going to go closer and closer to our original form, which I believe to be one of purity, authenticity, and an inclination, we curious beings by nature, to go for the truth, to uphold higher principles. And as that becomes aligned with knowledge and truth, then it's going to result in a genuine revolution. Because something I like to say is that, people they say, oh, you just have to be a good person. That's massive bullshit, because the easiest people to manipulate in this world are those with big hearts but small minds, which is to say you have a lot of feeling and emotion, but your awareness, your understanding and your pursuit of truth is not particularly refined and dedicated. But those two things have to come together in order for us to create a better world. Otherwise, those emotions, that moral outrage can always be weaponized, right? Every single war is preceded by the evil terrorists, man. We need to go get them. And what happens, as the saying goes, those who can get you to believe in absurdities can get you to commit atrocities. So we weaponize our nature against us because we don't fundamentally even know ourselves, and we aren't aligned, at least in a formidable sense, with the tenets of truth.
Well said, Gavin.
Yeah.
Love you, bro. I love
Definitely.
The conversations we always have here, man. And I'm grateful for you and grateful to have you on.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, man. Always awesome. You guys always ask great questions, and appreciate you giving me also just the space and the platform to kind of just blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, so man, we love it, especially with a subject like this. Maybe in previous episodes, people have touched upon it, but we wanted to explore this a little bit in more detail and more nuance. And like we said at the beginning of this episode, this could be 100 hours long, and we probably wouldn't skim the surface of so much that's out there. That being said, those that listen to this, you're curious, investigate, explore further. And I'm sure we'll probably maybe doing more episodes on this at some point in the future.
Yeah, it needs to start getting broached, man, this topic, because if it's not, Anytime that a voice that is not motivated by a simple introductory human decency remains silent, then you acquiesce to those who have ulterior, sinister motives. And in that way, we've got a moral duty to actually speak up.
Totally, man. And I think it's super timely. I definitely think the landscape and the terrain, even energetically, is shifting. Some of the topics that we touched on, you have been so sensitive for such a long period of time, including like questioning the Holocaust, official numbers and things like that as well, which, 5-10 years ago, hell, 2-3 years ago, probably never would have, been ripe enough to even question and to be digested in a rational way by those who are listening. So thanks once again, and looking forward to further exploring this topic down the road, potentially with multiple minds, including yourself.
That's the best way to do it, man.
Yeah, cool. As always, guys, thanks for listening. See you next time.
Real quickly, Gavin, I know you have different ways people can support you. Just give a shout on that.
My Patreon is currently my primary means, man. People can hop over to my Patreon. They can check it out at first. If you want to hang around, it is a free tier, but for as little as just $1 a month, you can help to support an independent educator. And to me, the significance corresponds to actually supporting the independent farmer. Like, it has to be done on some level. And not to be too patronizing, but people should put their money where their mouth is, man. Doesn't mean you have to dish out all your money, man. Oh shit, I'm cash strapped, but $1 a month, very little. And at the same time, as the saying goes, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And so we need to recognize, like, this is a collective effort. And I believe that the way we truly vote is not by, you put somebody in this White House that's surrounded by corruption and so on, and everything's going to magically change. It's surrounded by taking the moral responsibility and sense of duty that everything I do, including how I vote with my money, my lifestyle, my ideology, the way I treat other people, and that's far more formidable in changing the proverbial landscape for a better way.
Yeah, dude. Bro, you're such a potent mind and an incredible researcher. And I just really feel like it's really difficult to kind of receive the true value of what you do and what you dig into. So do you have like a direct PayPal if people wanted to just kind of support what it is that what you do with, $5, $10 that we could link in the brief as well?
No, I don't. The thing is, I am very much working on doing that digital school, man, because I just love to be an educator. Yeah, I love to be an educator. But in terms of the Patreon, that's just, now that's the best place to reach me. I did create a PayPal account years ago, man, and I got like nothing. So it was so discouraging. It was like, yeah. But I mean, you've also got to be consistent and, keep the morale up in doing this. And as you said, man, people don't entirely see the value. But again, with like the independent farm in the past, they didn't see the value either.
Yeah.
And so those who are kind of at the forefront, that they said, okay, I can see what's going on. I see the writing on the wall. Truth and information, which is in fact what even allows us to ascertain what good and bad food really is. If that's gone, I can't make better decisions. And so the people that are at the forefront and they're starting to say, okay, I'm going to finance people, even if it's with $1 a month, man, my hat goes off to you, because you are seeing something that other people simply have not become aware of yet. But mark my words, we are going to have to become aware of it. Otherwise, there's going to be an unprecedented monopoly on what we consider information.
Cool. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Wow. Obviously a lot of information to sit with and grapple with and wrestle with. That's part of the process, the critical thinking process, the process of having an active mind. If you'd like to support this podcast, if you're into what we do, you can support us by becoming a member on one of the tier options at friendsofthetruth.co. And in exchange, we're offering private monthly calls and so much more.
Smoking mirrors, I'm seeing through the illusion. Waking up in a time, they think you're in a delusion. Somebody set the alarms, cause they be too busy snoozing. I'm in a DeLorean, fast forward in evolution.